The second phase of the third seabed search is over. Armada 7806 has moved on to the next project. We have a couple of months at least until any further progress is made, so I want to review where we are. 250,000 square miles has now been searched, including about 10,000 square kilometers in 2025. This is not any old stretch of ocean. This is the area containing the vast majority of the search probability calculated by Australia's top scientists. This is where they calculated the plane would be. So far, it isn't. So there's two possibilities, two competing hypotheses. Either the Inmarsat data is good, in which case it's overwhelmingly likely that the plane went south, but just hasn't been found. The other possibility is that the Inmarsat data isn't good, that it's been tampered with, in which case the reason the plane hasn't been found is that it isn't there. Now, it's really important to understand that the more the seabed that gets searched without finding it, the more the probability zone gets excluded, the less likely hypothesis 1 becomes, and the more likely hypothesis 2 becomes. So this is why at this point I believe that the prediction of hypothesis 2, which I first pointed out back in 2015, is now overwhelmingly more likely and will only become more so as further seabed gets searched without finding the wreckage. The failure of the seabed search means that the plane did not go south, unless there is an escape hatch to this logic. Under the principle of Cromwell's rule, which is an aspect of Bayesian inference, which I discussed in episode 21, amassing more evidence that undercuts a theory does not change its probability if there is a 0% chance that it's wrong. This, in a nutshell, is why so many of the people who've been following MH370 and theorizing about the case refuse to accept that the plane might not be on the southern seabed, because they assign a 0% chance to this being possible. It's simply inconceivable to them.
Inconceivable!
It's a blind spot. It's a mental blind spot. It's an aspect of the case that they are unable to see. So in today's episode, I want to explain and explore why they have decided that it's inconceivable. And I want to explain why I think their uncertainty rests on shaky foundation. I'm also going to talk about my new feature article in Vanity Fair, which is about the new threat to aviation safety, and frankly provides important context for understanding what happened to MH370. That's all coming up right now. Okay, before I leap into it, I do want to offer my heartfelt thanks to the new paid subscribers on the show page, Christopher O'Grady and Brett Glossop. And I also want to thank the new paid subscribers to the YouTube channel, Gavin Finlayson and Kimberly H. Thanks so much to you, and thank you to my previous stalwart subscribers who have maintained their support over the months and years. Now, let's start off with a sense of certainty that the plane went south. I've often talked about how by June 2014, a solid consensus had formed around the idea that the Inmarsat data meant that the plane must have gone south into the southern Indian Ocean. But I had begun to realize that there was an alternative explanation for that data, namely that somebody could have snuck through the unlacked hatch to the EE bay and fed spoof data into the SDU's Doppler precompensation system. In other words, the plane could have been cyber hijacked. At the time, I was a member of a group of online individuals who had taken to calling themselves the Independent Group. Many of these people had impressive technical credentials and were really instrumental in explaining to the general public what the Inmarsat data was and what it meant for the fate of the plane. Of those people, none was more crucial than a Colorado satellite communications engineer named Mike Exner. I've talked before about some of the personalities involved in the public effort to solve the mystery of MH370. I would put Mike in the same category as Victor Ianello in terms of someone who actually knows what he's talking about, technically speaking. It's not an exaggeration to say that without Mike Exner, I don't know if any of us would really have managed to understand what the Inmarsat data was all about. And why, if it's read as written, it really unambiguously means that the plane went south for sure. But here's the thing. Mike is completely unable to accept even a 0.0001% chance that the Inmarsat data could have been tampered with. And I think more than anyone else on the planet, he has used his influence to ensure that that possibility is regarded as, frankly, a conspiracy theory. It's a silly nonsense. And, I would say that the venue in which he exerted that influence most powerfully was in the Netflix documentary, MH370, the plane that disappeared, that I was also in. If you've seen it, you'll recall that in episode 1, I explained how Captain Zahari might have hijacked the plane. In episode 2, I explained how Russian hijackers could have done that electronic spoof I mentioned earlier. I think the filmmakers did a really good job overall of allowing me to explain the basic principles of that idea. But then they pretty much blow the theory clean out of the water by allowing Mike Exner to say this.
I'm intimately familiar with how that satellite system works, as are a number of my colleagues, and we're absolutely certain that the plane turned south and not north. It was surprising that Jeff decided to take off on this route. Jeff's work, in my opinion, is simply a fiction that he has woven and convinced himself is feasible, but it's all based on fantasies. It's not based on reality.
In the context of the show, it's really completely unambiguous that Mike is right. Anyone who's watching at home is going to understand that the idea of a third-party attack is just silly. Mike has that weight of authority. But of course, out of the context of the documentary, I think it's really worth asking, if we're going to be serious about solving this mystery, why is he so sure that there's a 0% probability? What does he know that makes him so confident? Well, the simplest thing to do is just to ask Mike. So I sent him a DM on Twitter and he responded. And this is what he said. He said, quote, "There is zero evidence 370 was the subject of a cyber attack. On the other hand, there are multiple lines of solid evidence Zahari hijacked his own plane and flew it to the southern Indian Ocean. You know that as well as I do. So why keep playing this game?" Of course, I strongly disagree that there's zero evidence that the plane was cyber attacked, as I've laid out in 2 seasons of this podcast. What's germane, what's relevant to the point that I'm making today is that Mike does not think I'm right. He has never been willing to entertain the possibility, all the way back to 2014 when I was kicked out of the independent group for publicly raising the possibility of a hack. Specifically in late 2014, the independent group, of which I obviously was a member, published a white paper in which they calculated an endpoint for MH370 in the hopes that the Australian and Malaysian governments would go look there. I was one of the co-signers of that paper. The paper said that the plane had flown most likely to 37.71 degrees south, 68.75 degrees east. Uncertain by perhaps 100 nautical miles along the arc and within 20 nautical miles on either side of the 7th arc. Their search area looked like this. Then a few months later, I observed that a hack was possible, and that if someone had carried it out, the plane would not be found in that area. It wouldn't be in the Southern Ocean at all. And because I said that, because I went on international media to say that, I was kicked out of the group for raising that doubt. Now, what's extremely, important to understand here is that I was right and they were wrong. The plane was not found in the search area that they suggested in that paper. Of course, they revised their search area, and then that area was searched without success as well. In fact, time after time, as the years went by and the independent group and other experts refined their understanding and tried to make sense of why the plane kept on not being found, they would propose a new area. That new area would also get searched, and it also wasn't there. Every analysis of the Zaharie suicide flight scenario that's been tested has not been proven. The evidence has not been there. So, as I said up top, the evidence keeps piling up against hypothesis 1 and in favor, logically, of hypothesis 2, because something happened to the plane. If it wasn't 1, it had to be 2. The more one possibility goes down, the other has to go up. And yet all of the people who accept the conventional wisdom are not willing to admit the slightest glimmer of self-doubt. They will not investigate the issue. They will simply declare that it is too ridiculous to discuss. So why? Why are they so stuck in the mud? There's really 2 main objections to a cyber attack scenario, which I freely acknowledge. Any potential hijacker has 2 very technically difficult challenges to overcome if they want to steal the plane and take it north. One is that they have to alter the BFO data to leave a false trail of breadcrumbs. The second is that they have to fly the plane from the electronics bay. If either of these 2 things is impossible, then it is not possible that the plane was hijacked by someone other than its own flight crew and then it was flown to the north instead of to the south. But the standard is high. Right? To show that the idea is 0.0000000% possible, meaning completely impossible, you can't just explain how difficult it would be, how smart a person would have to be, how elaborate their equipment would have to be. You have to demonstrate that it is physically impossible. And let me say that there are a lot of situations in which both of those things would be quite clearly impossible. For instance, it would not be possible to do this spoofing attack on a 757 because it is not a fly-by-wire plane. It would not be possible on any Airbus aircraft because the electronics bay is not accessible from the passenger cabin, and so on. In fact, for the vast majority of planes flying in 2014, and pretty much all of the planes flying today, the vulnerability that I'm proposing does not exist. The idea really is 100% physically impossible, but not for MH370. This particular aircraft on this particular route is different. There is no physical or electronic obstacles that I'm aware of that anyone has ever pointed out to me that makes either of these things impossible. Let's go through them one after the other. Let's start with the BFO data. I came up with this idea. Victor Ianello really elaborated on it quite a bit, as I described in episode 10 of season 1. The idea is that the box that creates the BFO values, the satellite data unit, calculates it from navigational data that it obtains from another box in the electronics bay. And if you jack in onto the AirRank 629 bus or whatever and feed it falsified location information, or if you patch into the SDU box itself and change an internal parameter, the plane will send signals that leave the false impression that it has flown into the southern Indian Ocean. And then that allows the perpetrators to get away scot-free to the north. Why is this impossible? In the Netflix documentary, Mark Dickinson of Inmarsat has this to say.
The idea that someone predicts that we would analyze this data in this way, when we've never done it in the past before, doesn't seem particularly credible at all.
What he says in the documentary here, this has been Inmarsat's position since 2014, when I interviewed them along with Miles O'Brien for a Nova documentary. Inmarsat scientists cannot imagine how someone else could be so smart as to have figured out this attack vector before they did. This is a very dangerous mentality to have in a contested security environment, that your attacker can't possibly be more clever than you. And very much worth noting, he's not saying that there's any physical reason why the spoof couldn't be carried out. In my reading, he's tacitly acknowledging that it could be. All right, let's move on to part 2. Can you fly a 777 from the electronics bay? Mike Exner says no. I wanted to understand why, so I DM'd him on Twitter. he expressed his skepticism this way. He wrote, quote, "Do you have specific information that a 777 can be controlled from the EE bay? The absence of any documentation supporting that theory should answer that question." And I wrote back to him, I said, quote, "So to make sure I understand correctly, you consider a system safe against cyber attack so long as there is no documented evidence that a vulnerability exists," end quote. To be clear, if it isn't manifestly clear already, I was being sarcastic. If you're in a security mindset, you do not assume that you are safe just because, nobody has published a description of the vulnerability. You have to assume that you are vulnerable. It's like if you've got a house in a bad neighborhood, you can't just assume that your doors and windows are locked because you haven't heard otherwise. You have to check every window and door in order to really know that you're safe. Another skeptic about how to fly a plane from the electronics bay is Maud Fouad Chazuli, who served as crisis director for MH370 and MH17 in the wake of those incidents. And he was interviewed also for the Netflix documentary. This is what he had to say.
Anyone who gets into the hatch can disable the transponder and disable the communication systems. But it is impossible to fly the aircraft from the avionics compartment. It is impossible.
So I reached out to him to ask him how he could be so certain that it's impossible. I wrote to him on LinkedIn and he answered, quote, "It is simply impossible to control the aircraft, flight, and engine controls from anywhere else other than the cockpit. Whilst there are flight and engine control computers in the avionics compartment, there is no equipment to provide inputs into these computers like throttle, control columns, rudder controls, flaps, etc. The computers receive those inputs directly from the cockpit via sensors in the inputs. Secondly, there is no provision on this particular aircraft, 9M MRO, that was designed to be controlled remotely. Hence my conclusion that this is just impossible to control the aircraft from the avionics compartment." Well, listen, I was very grateful to Fouad for responding to me. I had two questions, though. And so I wrote back to him. I wrote, "You are, of course, entirely correct that there are no control inputs in the electronics bay. So if one were to enter if you were to enter it empty-handed, it would be entirely impossible to control the plane from there. And I agree that it would be impossible to control the plane remotely. However, I wonder if you've considered whether the flight control system might be vulnerable to a sophisticated attacker who is equipped with the gear necessary to patch into the ARINC 629 bus. I've been speaking with a number of leading cybersecurity experts as part of my reporting, and it appears that the ARINC 629 was not built with any kind of security layer. It's hard to know for sure without conducting a full penetration test, ideally with the cooperation of Boeing and leading suppliers. But it seems that it might be possible to, at least in principle, to spoof the control system signals to take command of flight surface actuators." He responded, quote, "Firstly, I have to admit that I'm not an expert on the aircraft navigation system. However, with my aviation knowledge as an aircraft engineer and in flight operations, I still very much doubt your theory. While it may be possible to hack the ARINC 629 computer and processing unit, the net effect of this would send spurious fault warnings to the cockpit. However, this would not result in the aircraft maneuvering into a new flight path, as this would require physical pilot's input, which can only be done from the cockpit. The autopilot would automatically disengage, which will require pilot's direct control of the aircraft. Even though I don't see how it is possible to track the system remotely, as there is no electronic or mechanical means of doing so remotely, the system is very much tamper-proof." Okay. Again, I was grateful to Fouad for responding, and I'm still grateful for his responding. But frankly, I find his answer unconvincing. Longtime viewers of this podcast will know that I've talked to a number of cybersecurity experts. Not one of them has told me that hacking into a flight control system from the electronics bay is impossible. There's been a lot of skepticism as to whether this has been carried out, but no one has said, no, you cannot do this. And to be frank, I believe that Fouad honestly believes that you cannot do this, but he is not a cybersecurity expert. At one point in his career, he worked in aircraft maintenance, but after obtaining an MBA, he became employed in crisis management, which is a branch of corporate communications. He's not a cybersecurity expert, and he has not studied aircraft control systems or vulnerabilities. And as he himself puts it, I am not an expert in the aircraft navigation system, but I still very much doubt your theory. While his position is that he very much doubts my theory, but he goes down in front of the cameras and says it's impossible. He is shown on Netflix saying that this cannot be done. It's cut and dried. And so to a viewer who sees this, they come away with the conclusion that, okay, this idea has just been shot out of the water. It is impossible. There is every difference in the world between 99.99% impossible and 100% impossible. And what I'm hearing again and again is that there are a number of people who all have strong gut feelings. They can't imagine a cyber hacker taking control of a 777, and they've all collectively convinced themselves that there's a 0% chance that they're wrong, so they don't even ever have to look closely at the issue. They can just rest comfortably with their sense of certitude. And every time they suggest a search area and say that the plane must be there and it's not, they don't have to revisit their sense of certainty because there's a 0% chance that such wise and studious people could be wrong. Okay, so obviously I disagree with that perspective. I think that we need to open ourselves up to the possibility that all of this failure to search the seabed actually means something, that there's a reason for it. It's not just blind bad luck. But how am I going to get anyone to change their minds? How are people going to distance themselves from this absolute sense of 100% certainty? Is there anything that could shake these people out of their complacency? Is there any development in the world that could cause them to wonder if maybe the world doesn't work the way that they think it does? Up at the top of the show, I mentioned that I have a new article out in Vanity Fair. It's called Flight Risk, and it's about, cybersecurity in aviation. I'll put a link in the show notes if you want to go check it out. Or better yet, go to a newsstand if such a thing still exists and buy a physical copy. You can get an actual article in your hands. This is an article that really started for me with MH370, the possibility of cyber attack. Because if MH370 really was taken by sophisticated third-party attackers, that fact would have a number of consequences. It would predict certain things. For instance, it would predict that a sophisticated and malicious entity, what's known in the trade as a persistent threat actor, is out there in the world doing harm. And lo and behold, that prediction was borne out. In the wake of MH370, Russia has been waging a wide-ranging campaign of sabotage, assassination, and cyber attacks against the democratic West, what we call hybrid warfare. Obviously, this is something I've had numerous episodes about. As the years have gone by, the picture has become clearer and clearer. Russia, who I pointed out in 2015 would be the culprit if MH370 was hijacked, Russia has done more and more things that are consistent with that. They have shot down airliners. They have hijacked airliners. They have conducted wide-ranging spoofing attacks against airliners' GPS systems. They've planted incendiary devices in air cargo. As Keir McCullum, the director of Britain's Domestic Intelligence Service, said recently in a rare public speech, Russian military intelligence, quote, is on a sustained mission to generate mayhem on British and European streets, end quote. He added, quote, we've seen arson, sabotage, and more dangerous actions conducted with increasing recklessness, end quote. And yet the aviation community has been slow to wake up to the threat of cyber attack, and particularly slow to recognize its acute vulnerability to cyber attack from Russia. And within the MH370 community, there is still a steadfast resistance to the possibility of cyber attack, despite everything that's happened. And I think a big part of that is that there's a lot of very influential people who would feel their status as experts undermined if they were to admit that they were wrong about such a substantial aspect of the case. I think it's about ego, frankly. But I would once again beg, plead, urge, prostrate myself to everyone involved in this case to please reconsider. Let bygones be bygones. This case is too important to get hung up on personal ambitions. The more the seabed search fails, the more urgent it is to consider what the alternatives are. The only thing we have to lose are our chains. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Again, for more information, please visit the show page at findingmh370.com. Thank you so much to everyone who subscribed there or taken a paid membership here on YouTube. If you have any questions or suggestions, I would be delighted to hear them in the comments or in the chat on findingmh370.com. So for now, this is Jeff Wise signing off. See you next time.